All right, well, we'll just work with it. Let me draw my map of the Holy Land. This was Israel up here. And this was the 10 tribes, and this was Judah down here. And these were the 2 tribes, which made up the 12 tribes of Israel. Now Ephraim, and then they were in here. They were the sons of Joseph that they came out of Egypt. This is the Samaritan area now. It became the Samaritans. And no good God-fearing, loving Jew would ever be found caught in that area. That was just, they were considered unclean forever by these people and these people. And it was just simply prejudice and all that stuff. And it dates back generations. It's just like today, you know, our people, our African-American people want reparations for being slaves. Well, how many of them were slaves? None of them. How many of them knew slaves? Probably none of them.
Not in this country.
Well, and that's the point. But the hatred and the gimme carries on for eons. Well, the same thing happened which created the Samaritans. The Samaritans really didn't come to be until after the Jews came back from Babylon. When they came back under Zerubbabel, they started to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the city, and they started with the walls, because if they could build a good defensive wall, oops, that's in the wrong place. If they could build a really good defensive wall, then they could protect themselves from the enemies that surround them. So, but that was in, I want to say it started at around 587. For something, probably around 470, 480. They came back from Babylon and they began to build the walls, and they tried to build the temple, and they dedicated the temple. We know this for a fact. They dedicated the temple in 414. So that was the official end of the Exodus, if you will, when they got yanked out of here, dragged over to here, brought back, and a couple of kings were involved in that, Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes and those guys. And eventually they came back and they rebuilt. Well, when they started rebuilding the walls, the people that were left behind, that the Babylonians didn't want, and that would be all the handicapped people, all the infirmed people, all the sick people, all the elderly people, the ones that would just be a burden on the Babylonians, they didn't want them. They wanted the young, strong children to become their slaves and servants. All the men, they usually just killed them, put them to sword. So they brought the people they wanted back here, and they grew up as, you know, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all those guys were probably around 9 to 11 years old or so when they were dragged out of here. They're coming back now as grown men. They're coming back as, you know, I don't know, 70 years have passed basically. Well, actually not 70 until they built the walls and consecrated it. That was 70. So they're probably coming back now as 48, 50, 55-year-old men. And they would become the leaders of the New Jerusalem. Well, when they came back under a man named Zerubbabel, they started building, and all these people that were left behind, the non-desirables, they wanted to help. They wanted to restore Jerusalem and build Jerusalem and make it great again. But for some reason, these guys, having been the ones to go over there and then come back, said, we don't want you. And that's where it started. In fact, they kept trying, and they bring in bricks and stuff. And finally, what's his face? Posted guards. I have to go back and read it. The histories, I forget some. I'm an old guy, you know that, don't you? Anyway, they posted guards under threat of death. You guys step into our land again, and we will kill you. And we just want to help. We don't want your help. Well, we want to praise our God. He's not your God anymore. He's our God. So this created an area of real hatred. And it was basically, this, all the way up to the Jezreel Valley. The Jezreel Valley is right about there. Anyway, all the way up to the Jezreel Valley and down to Jericho almost was the land of the Samaritans. So if you were up here and you wanted to come down to the temple to worship, you would go down here and then cross over the Jordan, come down here and re-enter through Jericho, and then go up to the temple, up the mountains to the temple to worship. And the same trip home. And they did that for hundreds of years, folks. 414 years between them and when Christ came back. So by the time Christ came back, even Jesus was, doing this nonsense. But in the meantime, a lot of times Jesus just said, this is all a bunch of non-desirable thinking. So he would do this, and that would infuriate the priests every time because he would be unclean for going into this. Jacob's well is right smack in the middle of the Samaritan land. And that's where Jesus meets the woman at the well, you remember, and they carry on there. So anyway, that's kind of the typography, and how it's being formed is, you saw in Jonah was told, he was up here and he ran away, and then God barked him back up on the shore and said, I want you to go to Nineveh, which is way up here, which is like modern day Damascus, and Babylon is way up, oh look, it's already there. There's Babylon, and this is the great Fertile Crescent, if you know that, and the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, and this was the Fertile Crescent that we always talk about in 5th grade science, where man was supposedly first developed or whatever. So that's where we are. Biblical history is we are these guys, after Jonah. These guys repent and everything, and then they get a new king, and he's got a huge army, and he doesn't respect anybody, and brings them around here, and I'll explain that in a second, and destroys the northern kingdom. He says, I don't believe in their God. Their God can't even protect his own people. But the mistake there was, the Jewish God, Yahweh, was mad at his people, because they all went back to being real ugly people. And they built the altars up in the high places. You'll hear a lot of talk about the altars on the high places. Well, those were Baals. Those were fertility gods and goddesses. And they would go up there and they'd participate in literally what we would call an orgies, just drinking and sexing and, worshiping false gods. And that's what Israel became. A lot of the prophets, the major prophets, spent a lot of time up in Israel saying, you guys are really going down the wrong road here. You need to stop. Nahum came up, he was the commander of the Assyrian army. He came down here once to scope stuff out, and he had leprosy, if you remember. Nahum was the commander of the Assyrian army at the time, and he came down here and he found Elijah, and they said, well, Elijah can heal you. A little Jewish girl told him that. Well, Elijah was over here, this is the Mediterranean Sea, at a point called Mount Carmel, and that was this here. And he was basically hiding out from the kings of Israel, which was Ahab and Jezebel. And they were not nice people, Ahab and Jezebel, and they encouraged all of this mountain worship and fertility worship and that stuff. In fact, she enlisted for herself 450 priests to lead this kind of stuff and made a national movement, of turning away from Yahweh and turning to all the Baals and the Asherites and all those. The male and female false deities is who they were. So that's what was going on throughout Israel. I mean, really bad. So much so that Elijah finally left, came over here. Nahum, the commander, came down here to scope it out, and a little Jewish girl said, well, Elijah could heal you. So, of course, hearing this, knowing that he was a dead man soon because of leprosy, he put a great entourage together with gifts and clothes and foods and golds and silvers and all that stuff, and came to Elijah to beg his mercy to heal him. And Elijah wouldn't even come out and see him. He said, I want to see you. And he got this thing, he got all upset, why? Because I'm not a Jew, I'm not this, I'm not that. He said, no, I don't want your stuff. And God is not something you can purchase or bargain with. God is God. And until you learn that and respect that and humble your mighty, holy self, God wants nothing to do with you, and I want nothing to do with you. Now, I'm a little rough on Elijah's part. Suffering for my sin. I was a little rough on Elijah's part, but it sent the message. Nahum got all bent out of shape, got his little undies in a twist, and he started off and he beat up a couple of Israelis. He said, let's go back to Nineveh. Why should I put up with this? And the little servant girl said, you know what? You are some kind of a piece of work. She was a southern Jewish girl. You are a piece of work. Of course, Nahum said, hold your tongue. She said, I will not. I have served you my whole life, which was about 10 years. She was 10 years old. If Elijah would have asked you to go and kill a bear with your bare hands, you'd have done it. If Elijah would have said, go and kill all of this army or that army, you'd have done it. But what did Elijah ask him to do? Well, go down to the Jordan River and bathe yourself in it 7 times. There's that number 7 again, God, man, together thing. Go down in and bathe and come back up and go back down and bathe again and come back up. And then go take a big bottle of body wash with you. Just go down 7 times. If you'd have done that, you'd have been healed of the disease. How come you can't humble yourself before God that you're begging for mercy of? Well, Nahum talked about that for a while. Out of the mouths of babes comes the wisdom of God. So then he got mad and he goes, well, why's it got to be this nasty little Jordan River? What if I just go home and bathe in the mighty Euphrates, which, by the way, goes all the way up there? Why can't I just go bathe in the mighty Euphrates? And the little girl said, because it's not about the mighty nothing. You need to humble yourself, go down and bathe in that water 7 times. Well, he did that, and we are told that he came out as clean and as pure and as smooth as a newborn baby's. And he was made whole, and he went back to Nineveh. He said, okay, I'll leave these Jews alone. Well, I'm not sure whatever happened to Nahum. He might have been killed in battle, he might have been something somewhere else. But another guy came to power with the new king, and his name was Sennacherib. And that was all we know him by. Sennacherib, and Sennacherib.
Can you spell that?
Huh?
Can you spell that name?
Sennacherib.
Sennacherib.
You're asking a lot here.
Senachar, Sennacherib. Anyway, that was his name. And he was now the commander of the army under the new king up in Nineveh. And same army, still got these 80 billion guys. And he hated the Jews and convinced the young king to hate the Jews. And everybody convinced everybody to hate the Jews. And they started to sweep around this way. The Jews for a while was paying tribute to the new king because he demanded money. He said, you give me all your gold and your temple chalices and all that stuff that you use for your worship, and we'll take the gold and melt it down and pay our soldiers, and you give us all your stuff. Well, that went on for a while, and then finally a king came to Israel, and in the end there was a string of bad kings. And one finally said, we're not paying them anymore. We ain't got nothing to pay them with. Nothing's left. Everything they have everything ours. And then they decided, well, we'll just go down there and see how powerful their God is. And they destroyed Israel is what they did. And they destroyed the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, burned it to the ground, every village, all the people. They didn't take anybody back as slaves. They just killed everybody. They didn't want anybody. Well, what they didn't understand is that Israel had gone real bad and pulled away from God real bad. And it was their fault that they got destroyed. God simply allowed that army to do it. And people say, well, Tom, what proof of that have you got? Well, I got proof. And I'll tell you how. Afterwards, this mighty army of 187,000 men, who can stop that, came down and they said, we're going to get rid of the Jews forever. Under Sennacherib and his boys. And they did come down and they surrounded Jerusalem. They destroyed many small villages. And they surrounded Jerusalem. And this was when they had good kings, King Uzziah, King Joash, guys like that. And they were very religious and very much godly men, and the kings were, and the people were likewise. And that's when Uzziah went into the temple. Sennacherib wrote a real ugly note about how worthless their God is. And he took it in the temple, put it on the altar, and begged God's mercy. He says, I don't know what to do. We can't stop this army. And that's when God spoke to him and said, I want you all to go up on the walls and party. Release the wineries, release the granaries, the temple. Eat, drink, get the musicians all up on the walls. Have the women go home and make themselves ready as if for a wedding. Get up on the walls. I want you to dance. I want you to sing. I want you to eat till you just stuffed. And just have a good time tonight. Well, they did that. Of course, Uzziah didn't understand. He was okay. So they did that until they all exhausted themselves and fell asleep. And of course, when they woke up the next morning, 187,000 men lay dead around the walls of Jerusalem. So much so that it took the people in Jerusalem, they all ran in there because of the walls. It took them 4 days to haul all the stuff into Jerusalem. 4 days to bring all their horses and food and metals and army weapons and stuff like that. So they got 4 days of spoil. I don't know what they did with all those bodies. Probably had some real big bonfires going for a while. But nevertheless, no sword was drawn, no arrow was flown, no anything. I just put a black mark on my shirt. Nothing happened. And yet the biggest army, biggest battle ever fought in the biblical times. And heaviest losses. And no one drew a sword. How amazing is that? Well, you say, well, what does that mean, Tom? Well, what that means is these guys were doing what God wanted to do. This was Judah. They were still godly. And God protected them, just as he promised in his covenant. Your friends will be my friends, your enemies will be my enemies. These guys did not go with God. They said, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to have fun up on the mountaintops. And what they failed to understand is that these men and women were allowed to be destroyed because they had turned away from God. Jesus said at the Last Supper, apart from me, what can you do? Nothing. Apart from me, you have no life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Apart from me, what do you got? You got squats. What do you got? You got nothing. As long as you're branched, grafted onto me like the vines do, you can produce fruit, you can grow, you can be successful, you can be blessed mightily. But the minute you sever that, you wither and die. And you see this imagery all through the Old Testament, but Jesus spoke the same imagery. When he was talking about the vine, the branches, the this, the that, the way, the truth, the light, everything's connected. And if it's not connected to God, then you got squat. I don't care how many cars you own, how big a company you own, how many men you order around. That doesn't make any difference. Not to the Lord. Whereas Jonah was about obedience, Nahum is about continuance. God was big enough to protect his people. He proved it. Boom, biggest battle in the whole of Scripture. But God is also about continuance. You don't get to be a Christian for a day. It's the minute you accept that position, it's a lifetime commitment. You know, kind of like the old story between the chicken and the pig. Remember that story? I haven't told you that story about the chicken and pig. Really?
I don't think so. I just don't remember.
It's the stupidest story seminarians tell. You can always tell somebody's in their freshman year, they'll tell us pig and the chicken story. Pig and the chicken raised up on the same farm, and they became best friends. So they both got said, well, you know, we're tired of this farm. Why don't we go out and make a life of our own? So they both leave, and they're walking through the field, and they said, well, what are we going to do to keep ourselves alive, keep ourselves going? And they said, well, you know, I heard these humans love to have breakfast. So why don't we open up a little restaurant and we'll serve them bacon and eggs? Well, the pig had a little problem with that. It says, for you, it's just a kind of an occasional contribution. For me, it's a life commitment. That's the story of the chicken and the pig. For me, to have bacon, it's going to cost me my whole life. For you, it's just an occasional contribution.
So are we chickens or are we pigs?
Are you chickens or are you pigs? Jesus softened that. He went with the sheep and the goat. The sheep was the one that was desirable for food. The goat, well, not so much. Not so much. And he softened it a little bit. It's the same story, you know. To one, it's an occasional deposit. The other, it's a life commitment. This is Nahum. Life commitment. People often ask, how long do I have to go to church? And how long are you going to keep breathing? You know? How long do I got to be a Christian? How long do you plan on breathing? Invictus learned that lesson. I'm not going to bow to anyone ever today. I am the master of my soul. The angel showed up and went, I can't breathe. No kidding. Because I'm choking you. And about a minute and a half later, he had this great conversion. And he bowed down on the deck of the deck of his ship, on his knees, and bowed his head. And he said, I will bow to the Lord. Lesson learned, hopefully. And see, that's the problem, is we see this. You know, I read a thing yesterday I really liked. He says, you know, all these stupid children out in the streets protesting Palestine and Hamas and all this, and being paid to cause trouble on the campuses and being paid. He says, whoever wrote it said, go and tell your children, listen here, history is not for you to erase or to destroy or to try and change. History simply is. What is or what was. And what is. History is not for you to erase, not for you to change, not for you to like or dislike. History is for you to learn. I don't care whether you agree with what happened. I don't care whether you disagree with what happened. The fact of the matter is what? It happened. Now, you can like it or dislike it, which will change nothing. Or you can learn from it. And if it was a bad thing, let's not do that again. That's what history is for. It's not for you or any kid. You want to tear down that statue. That man never existed. Well, he did. And he whooped up on some major other people and won mighty victories. And because you don't like it and you want to tear it down, doesn't change anything, does it? Doesn't change a thing. What it has changed, well, it has changed if you're tearing it down, because it's changed our society from being wise to being stupid. Stupid. There are some things in this world you're not going to control, ever. God said, go forth. You are my son, I will bless you, and I want you to subdue all of creation. Remember that? That was only if you stay connected with God. You stay connected with God, all that stuff will happen. You break away from God, what happens?
Doesn't happen.
You ain't got that power anymore, do you? That's what happened here. That's what happened here. Nahum is showing us this. What happened to Nineveh? Well, they all repented, and things were great for about 40 years. Until the new king came, a new commander of the army. They didn't care about Israel whatsoever. That traditional hate that they'd always known continued to their next generation. They came around thinking we're the strongest and that this God of Israel can't stop us. And it seemed like he was right because he destroyed the 10 tribes. What he didn't understand is this God of Israel had turned his back on Israel because of their separation from him. That's what we call sin. What is sin? Well, it's that separation right there from God, hamartia. And I've told you many times that's an archery concept. You got to hit that hole right in the center, and you hit way out here. What did you do? Well, you fell short of the glory of winning, didn't you? All flesh is falling short of the glory of God. What made Paul say that? Because he realized that flesh, like himself, caused God great harm. He had separated himself from God. Even the most ridiculous part, he was killing people in the name of the Lord, thinking he was doing something glorious. Wow. God punched him in the eye, knocked him off his horse. He couldn't see for 3 days. He said, Paul, you know what? Did you ever consider just one little thing? Your arrow's over here, Paul. You ever consider maybe you're wrong? Maybe what you're doing is not glorifying God? Oh, well, no, because I'm the best priest there ever was. Sure you are. That's why I knocked you off your horse, blinded you for 3 days. Well, folks, that's taught right here. Jonah, God said, go to Nineveh and preach. He did. Then he got angry about the fact God didn't waste him. Why would he do that? 40 years went by. These people got real ugly. Those people got real ugly. And the uglies met, and they had more uglies than these guys had uglies. And they did what the world does. It destroys itself. You know what we call that? History. They come down here to beat these guys, but they're not ugly. They're pretty people. They're beautiful people. They're sons and daughters of God. You think that he's going to let these uglies beat them up? That's Nahum, folks. Unfortunately, Nahum is preaching up here. Just as the army's coming, he's preaching up here and he's saying, look to the south. Some smart people probably left Israel and ran to the south. But most of them did not. And that's what... So you're going to see Nahum as a book of doom. As we did Jonah, you saw a bunch of hope there, didn't you? But what changed? 40 years went by. What changed?
Attitude.
Yeah, we changed. God doesn't change. He says, I am the same today, or yesterday, today, and forever. He says, not one word of my mouth. Some of this you can hear in the sermon today, folks. Not one word of my word, not one letter of my word will ever pass away. It will not change, ever. Well, if this talks about knowing God, and this talks about living God, I've heard that before somewhere. I'm not sure what it means. Knowing God, living for God. Now, that's faith, without which you cannot please God, and you will never be in the presence of God or under the protection of God until you know God and live for God. How long do I got to go to church? Until your last right to church is in a box. That's how long you got to go to church. The irony there is even after you're dead, you got to come to church. Or at least you should. That's Nahum, folks. Let me give you some dates. Look, I wrote them down right here. In 612, Nineveh will fall. Because they'll come down, they'll lose their army when God destroys them all. They'll go back, and in the year 612, a new kid comes to town called the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians. And they will come under their great king called Nabopolassar. Don't ask me how to spell that. Nabopolassar will come up here and waste... Huh? Stop it. You're speaking that crazy language. Nabopolassar. That was one name, not two. He wasn't Mr. Nabo. He was Nabopolassar. I don't know. It's Chaldean. I don't speak Chaldean. Anyway, he would go up and waste the Assyrians for all time. And that would happen in 612. Then he would come back and, build a great city, the great gardens of Babylon and all that stuff. And eventually he would get old and die, and his son would come to power that we know as Nebuchadnezzar. So Nabopolassar had Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay, that's the one I know.
Nobody wrote a check in that family because the line just wasn't long enough. And that's what would happen. So then we would know Nebuchadnezzar by virtue of the fact in 200 years or so, that sadly Judah would go bad too. So God would allow the Babylonians to sweep around and to destroy them. And of course, all the prophets in the Bible are down here preaching now saying, don't you remember what happened up here? How is it you're doing the same thing? You think God's going to let you get away with this? Of course, this is where you get the major prophets, Ezekiel and Daniel and all these guys. And Jeremiah, of course, that's the thing, where they're just pounding up saying, how stupid are you people? History is so that we learn how to not do it again. And they wouldn't listen. And they tore down their statues and they, tried to erase it. But you know what? Truth is truth. You can't erase it. It is what it is. So that's the whole thing. So we're going to study Nahum, and you're going to see this all start to unfold. But it's going to be kind of like, not quite the same as Lamentations. That was a real dumb. But it is, I know we're out of time. It is a book of doom. And it's the last straw of God, if you want to put it that way. Is there a line where God says, that's enough?
That was Amos.
Well, that was Amos too. Amos is the same thing. But Amos is down here. Is there a line that we can cross? I'm a Christian, I'm getting a little uglier, I'm a Christian, I'm still a Christian, I'm getting uglier, but I like this ugly. I'm still a Christian. Uh-oh. Is there a line that we can cross whereby we can't come back? Amos says, I think there is. Nahum's going to say, almost I think there is. Maybe. Not easy, but maybe. Paul is going to bring out the point of that. In Hebrews, he says, once a man's been enlightened and tasted the spirit of everything beautiful of heaven, and then has fallen away, it is impossible. Impossible is the word. No power on earth can do it. Impossible to renew him again. Because now he crucifies Christ himself in his own mind and heart. He's saying to me, well, God's stuff didn't work for me. I'm never going back to church. Wow. So, if you won't study history, you want to erase it, then you live as a fool who runs headlong off the cliff. If you look at what happen and say, man, could that ever happen again? The answer to that is yes. If you don't learn from what made it happen in the first place. This is why the prophets, with the support of the histories, are so important. They did it wrong. How can we do it right? And if you want a caricaturation of one man's life, that would be Paul. I did it wrong. Let me study my life. How can I do it right? That's when he gets to that beautiful verse. Everything I used to think was important is much newer. Next to knowing Jesus Christ as my Lord. I count all of that as lost, wasted time. Next to knowing Jesus Christ as my Lord. Everything I had, I gladly threw away. Next to knowing Jesus Christ as my Lord. Paul learned from his history. Sadly, we Americans aren't so bright. That's all I got. Next week we will do Nahum 1, probably 1 and 2 maybe, because they go together. And I will not bring a death smoothie next week. I told her there's no smoothies on Sunday. And she said, there's smoothies. And I said, that's good as long. She obviously doesn't